Alright, time for another DraftPhysics.com video presentation. DebatePhysics.com also, but still searching for a debater. No one will take my money or my offer, so till then, yeah, we're stuck with just me arguing little chunks of rhetoric thrown here and there, by snarky trolls. So anyway, so yes, more of the same this week in terms of videos. So I did do a video basically going over one of the standard histories that's just a pile of crap regarding the kinetic energy formula, blah, 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 blah. And then I did a little bit on springs. I did a response video to an Action Lab video that talked about photons as if it were possible that they actually interfered with each other or collided with each other or did anything with each other, that any force interacts with any force in the universe, which there's no evidence for. So it shouldn't even be implied as a possibility and such. Then on this channel, I did put this planar talk video, just getting to the push-pull argument that the push is obvious. Okay, you just throw something at something else. Something flies off of you, hits something else, push. There's no correlate for pull. There's no simple description of a pull. You can't make a pull as simple as you can make a push. Sort of indicating that if you were to say something is the elemental function in the universe, yeah, push is going to win easy, because pull isn't simple. There's no such thing as a simple pull. Alright, then whatever this Silence Asylum, yes, did some video on some silly crap about entanglement, and it was just silly. So I responded to the silliness. I did a comment video, this overview video from 2 weeks ago or whatever. I think it's a good video just to go over the fact that the perpetual motion machine, the kinetic energy theory, the fact that we're just waiting on Brozo, who was supposed to have made 2 new air tracks, but it'll be a month before we see anything. He's got carts, with hard drive driven wheels, all this stuff, but we never see anything. So just waiting on him producing some sort of evidence that has to be countered. And certainly if it's any kind of argument he's making in defense of any of these theories, that somehow you don't need to use momentum to create momentum, I mean, it's a simple enough principle, right? So let's just go over a couple of simple principles. I guess we don't need this, and we'll put the camera back on, I suppose, and get rid of that. Yeah, that worked. All right, so the kinetic energy argument in a nutshell, the simplest argument you can make is that there's really no way when something hits something, let's just say it's a bowling ball, all right, and you roll it and it hits a pin, okay, it can't give the pin momentum, it can't give it energy in this direction, all right, without this losing the energy. So as this arrow gets longer, okay, this arrow has to get shorter. All right, you have to use momentum to give something momentum. And this came up as a classic example of physics girl claiming that I take 2 equal mass objects, I bang them into each other, they stick together, they become a 2 mass object, okay, with 1/2 the velocity. And the argument is that the kinetic energy has been reduced by 1/2. And so somehow you lose something called kinetic energy, but you didn't use any momentum to lose it. It just doesn't make any sense on its face. You're just saying you can't possibly do anything in the universe. You can't create heat, you can't create sound, you can't create vibrations, you can't do any of that stuff unless you lose what you started with. So if you have 100 momentums here, okay, and for kinetic energy it would be 200, okay, and you're only going to end up with 100 here. Obviously momentum works just fine. It explains everything. You lose a little tiny bit, you end up with 99 here, okay, so you lose a little tiny bit in the sense you might make a little bit of sound, you might make some vibrations, you might create a little extra friction on the wheels, and everything works fine. Newtonian mechanics works fine. This mechanics doesn't make any sense. You lose half the energy, okay, and yet you have 100% just about of your momentum. So you're moving things without using your momentum, which is impossible. Nothing can make something else give something its momentum without losing its momentum. So just like I've used money metaphors, you have $10, okay, if you're going to give something, $1 worth of momentum, then you only have $9. That's the equal and opposite reaction. You give it away, you don't have it anymore. So it's that simple. I've pointed out that levers prove kinetic energy doesn't work. You use the lever the one way, heavy mass moving, light mass shooting. Okay, you gain energy. You do it the other way, light mass moving, heavy mass, you lose energy. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit the facts. There's no evidence for it. They're never going to show you it taking 4 times more gas, okay, to go twice as fast. All right, they're never going to show you that. It's never going to happen because it doesn't happen in reality. It's not a truth. All right, it's just a story. It's just a piece of fake evidence they throw in there as if it's a truth, as if that's how the universe works. It doesn't work that way. If you're in gravity, you go by an object, it's not about this distance. It's about how much time, okay, you're in the gravity, how much exposure you have to the force that is the gravity, the force differential. There's more force going this way than there is going this way. How much you're going to get moved depends on how long you're in that differential. The longer you're in it, the more you're going to get affected. The shorter amount of time you're in it, the less you're going to get affected. Those are the truth, facts. This should not be a contentious argument beyond somebody providing decisive evidence somewhere that any of this fake physics of losing and gaining energy, in this kind of moronic way without using any momentum is possible. It's not possible. Momentum is energy. Newton, Galileo, Descartes all had right answers. Leibniz was a religious kook. Again, the history is so ugly. I just don't understand why rational people won't concede that this needs to be redone, that their kinetic energy notions are just mushy and silly almost, and that it needs to be tightened up. I mean, the very fact that in the history it started off with mv squared, and they proved mv squared. They proved it. They were all satisfied. We proved it. And then 100 years later, they stuck a half in front of it. A dramatic, huge, gigantic change. So they proved something that they changed by 50%. I mean, come on. Come on. How can you trust that? It's terrible physics. It's terrible science. All right. So next subject. All right, the photon subjects. All right, so it starts with the classic Young experiment, but they already had a wave theory of light. So they already were thinking in terms of light being some contiguous thing that goes in all. One photon goes everywhere in some kind of wave. Like it's a giant ocean wave and it hits Hawaii and hits California and hits everywhere. This wave front that is a photon, even though they knew kind of, that the ray theory was kind of rational and viable in the sense that, single photons from distant locations would travel great distances, and that you could send light through little tiny apertures and you could see a whole image. So, it's sort of indicating you can't be waving photons through space and blah, blah. Well, anyway, so you have this classic drawing by Young that started this whole wave is the truth, waves are proven. And the truth is that this classic thing doesn't actually describe the real pattern, which, the real pattern has more nuance to it, has been discovered. All right, there's actually 2 patterns. There's a missing node here and here. Okay, so there can be there can be 3, there can be 5, there can be 7, there can be 9, there can be, continuing. There can be any odd number you want in the center, and this will be 1/2 of that odd number being the even number. So it's 15, there'll be 7, nodes here. And you can do all this. There's a strict mathematical consequence, and that the simple truth is that if you take the widest distance between two surfaces, that'll tell you how big these little nodes will be, these little dots, and it'll tell you exactly how many there are on a continuous arc. All right, and so the fact is that distance will tell you exactly how many nodes there can be, because it'll tell you, basically it's telling you there's a distance here between 2 point sources. Here's a point source and here's a point source. All right, and this is a point source and this is a point source. And the fact is that it's really just how many places would you be able to, from that distance, what places create a wavelength of difference. So wavelength of difference here, wavelength of difference here, full wavelength wavelength of distance here. And you only have certain number. And the narrower you make it, the fewer you have. And then this envelope pattern, that is the pattern that, decides which nodes are on and which ones are off, is being created by the shortest distance. So whatever the shortest distance between two surfaces is, that's telling you this envelope, and the small pattern is being dictated by the widest distance. So it really is the 4-surface experiment. So the 2-slit is the 4-surface experiment. The single slit, is the 2-surface experiment. The single impediment is the 2 surfaces, 4 surfaces. 4 surfaces create a complex overlapping pattern. 2 surfaces don't. I think these are irrefutable facts, and they clearly point to its rays, and that essentially it's just scatter. All that's happening is when the light's hitting by the surface, it's hitting some electrons, it's being scattered in terms of its direction, and now you're creating new sources, and they can be in phase or out of phase. It's a 50-50 chance that so when you scatter the light, you create essentially a 50-50 chance that at any one location there'll be close to a full wavelength or less than a full wavelength of light. So if it's not a full wavelength of difference, no light. If it is a full wavelength, they're back in phase, light. So no light, light. 50-50 chance. So you're just putting the photons back together. So you break them here, knock them out of phase in terms of changing their direction, that is, changing how far they'll have to travel to get to the surface. And by doing that, you're just either putting them back in phase, out of phase, out of phase, in phase, out of phase. And when you put the pieces, back in phase, then you have a photon. This is a photon. A photon is a series of events. A photon hits a surface, bang here, bang here, bang here, and by hitting the surface, it's basically pushing energy into electrons and making the electrons go faster and faster. And that's what we see is in terms of, we measure electricity. We measure electricity created in a substance to measure a photon, to detect a photon. That's what our eye is doing. That's what all our mechanical devices are doing, is in one way or another creating electrical phenomenon and calling that detection of a photon. But a photon is an event. It's made of a series of things. The things are randomly randomized by scattering off of surfaces. So all of the pattern is created by photons that have to go by the surface. Obviously, the wider the openings you make, the more light that hits the surface, the brighter the center gets, because it doesn't get deflected at all. It doesn't get scattered. Only the light goes near the surfaces gets scattered. So the particle theory wins by a mile. The wave theory has no hope. Certainly any idea that it duplicates any notion of round waves going through space doesn't win, can't be turned into the actual pattern. It doesn't mathematically fit. It doesn't explain, where the point source ray theory does explain and fills in all the gaps. And that's without even talking about radar experiments and other experiments that demonstrate it's not waves, and that it's really just about, in those cases, the fact that we can't detect the energy when it's out of phase. We don't have a radio receiver that can detect the same signal, sent from two different directions. If they're out of phase, we can't do it. The radio can't figure out which one it's supposed to be hearing. The two jam each other, okay? And essentially that's what's happening on the surface. All the energy still hits. The same amount of energy is hitting all places on the surface. And it's just in certain places where the light is reconstructed back into a photon, and in the other places it's chaos. It's not the right frequency. It's out of, the frequency is broken, okay? So you end up with something like that. Disorder, not the same distance between the impacts. When there's not the same distance, there's not a coherent photon. You can't add energy to a system. Again, this gets back to resonance and understanding resonant frequencies. And the fact is you have to be on resonance to be able to add energy to the electron system. The electron is basically a pendulum swinging, and you have to add the energy exactly as the electron is moving away, away, away. You have to add energy only when the electron is moving in the same direction you're adding the energy. If the electron's moving against you, then you won't be adding energy to the electron. Alright, so that's enough of the two slit. Alright, third subject. These are the basic ones. I mean, I could do entanglement and a few other silly extensions to the other bad theory. So really the bad theory of the double slit leads to entanglement theories and superpositions and all kinds of other nonsense about photons converting into different kinds of things. And then you have antiparticles and annihilations and creations and all that kind of stuff. That's all bullshit too. But the elemental, the foundations are where the bullshit is. There's no evidence for any of these theories. There's no hard evidence. Okay, so we have another one, which is Einstein, telling us that it's not so much that E equals mc squared is wrong, it's that this notion of space being a substance that can be bent, or that it's there's some sort of built-in mechanism, a geodesic they call it, that somehow, again, they can't illustrate it in anything but two dimensions. It's some kind of gravity well, and that things circle, they fall into the well, and spiral into a well created in some sort of thing called space, that somehow an electron sitting by itself knows that if there's another mass somewhere else, that somehow it's bent the space, and so now the space is bent and it has to fall into the bending. It's not an answer to the question what causes gravity, in the sense it's not a mechanical, there's no way to make the mechanical system in 3 dimensions without creating some sort of magical vacuum cleaner that just sucks space, okay? And that somehow things know the space is getting less, there's less size to the space, somehow it's contracting and it knows I have to go in. So it doesn't, you can draw it in 2 dimensions and you have some hope, but you really can't make a 3-dimensional model because it's a vacuum cleaner that just sucks into one little point in space and it doesn't exhaust anywhere. It doesn't make any sense as a theory. Now, all you're really trying to explain is the fact that on the surface of the Earth, what appears to be happening is whatever's pushing up, okay, whatever force there is going this way, is less than the force going this way. So you're stuck in some sort of river or stream. All right, and that's how they teach relativity. Einstein's theory, they teach it using mock gravity because it produces the right result. So it's like the opposite of the sun. You understand the sun is producing rays of light. well, you could understand that maybe if your brain isn't too warped, that it's hot, it's falling apart in a sense, pieces of it are flying out, little pieces, and they fall out, okay, in this proportional way from a sphere, and it creates the r squared rule, okay. So it basically does exactly the opposite. Light does exactly the opposite of what gravity would do in terms of this phenomenon, okay. Half the distance, 4 times bigger. So it's the same phenomenon. All you're really saying is, okay, let's say if the universe was full of little BBs of energy all moving at the speed of light, and then you could sort of understand that every point in space would be essentially a target, okay. It would be hit by energy from all sides, hitting it constantly. And the idea is that if those BBs had to stick to whatever they hit until something from the opposite direction hits and then they both can reflect, that the object would be pushed around, okay, the electron would get hit with the BB is going the speed of light, the object, the electron, goes something less than the speed of light, let's say even half the speed of light, when it only has one BB hitting it. And so now the force that would have been here, okay, is only here because it's pushing an electron. So clearly that could account for this differential in where the force would have been versus where it is essentially a reduction in the speed of light. It's no longer moving the speed of light in the sense it's no longer traveling the same distance because it's pushing a piece of matter. So as matter moves inside the Earth, as the molecules get hot, and they can't get hot without moving, and they can't move without being pushed. So if you understand that every molecule that's moving, every electron or proton that's moving inside an atom, and every atom that's moving, all of that jiggling is essentially consuming speed of light motion and converting it into something less than, the speed of light. And so less comes out of the Earth than goes into the Earth. The stuff going in is the little BBs. All right, inside the Earth, the BBs are being occupied, pushing matter around, pushing the wheelchairs, of electrons, and they are having essentially their momentum, a portion of it, consumed, and so they produce less force coming back out because it's all delayed, constantly delayed. Anything that goes in is delayed before it comes back out again, and that constant delay is essentially the differential between the force you feel from space pushing down and the force pushing you back up, and that's gravity. So you have a simple explanation, a mechanical explanation, versus this bent, warped, geodesic thing that electrons are somehow electron sits there and somehow it knows there's a bent geodesic, whatever the hell that would be, and whatever it will be made out of. Obviously plain space can't push an electron, empty space can't push it, so there must be something, and who knows what that something is and what you would make it out of. So their theory is far from complete, okay, it's far from elemental, it's not simple like a push, and you can't make much out of it. Now the only reason why Einstein's theory got off the ground was because of the famous Eddington experiment, in which Einstein had proposed, when he was obliged to do mathematics to explain the precession of Mercury, he stated that, well, for his relativity mush to work, this complex field equations, he needed light to be bent twice as much, okay, by gravity. So there was no evidence that forces can even be bent by another force. That is, you can't bend light with magnetism, you can't bend light with light. You can't, there's no evidence you can bend any of these forces. And yet light is supposed to be bent twice as much. Not just bent, but bent twice as much. Now, I would argue that they've proven neither. Neither that light is bent by gravity or that it's bent twice as much. In the Eddington experiment in Eddington's own journal, he stated, I wouldn't stake my life on the results. And he stated that because his results were 10% of the optical quality he was hoping for. 10%. It was that bad. He was hoping for 10,000 stars per picture. He got 1,000. Okay, 10% quality. So obviously not a great experiment, not great conditions, not even a perfect eclipse. You know, it wasn't perfectly 12 noon like the one we had over North America where they didn't repeat the experiment. So not a perfect eclipse, rain, all kinds of technical problems. And they've never redone the experiment with a comparable technology, with a quality telescope. And there's 400 times better resolution from space, 400 times better image quality. 400 times. So just put that 10% number in the context of 400 times better resolution from space. I mean, it's a huge advantage doing the experiment from space. We've had the capacity to do it for 50 years, and they haven't done it. Now you got to ask the question, why haven't they done it? They can do it with a GoPro camera from the space shuttle. No, it's that this is such a huge advantage. They could do a comparable experiment to this with a GoPro camera, and they haven't done it. So, I mean, there's good reason to doubt, okay? All of the images they show you of the little smiley faces, of the bent light from space, all of those images are mathematically problematic. Einstein stated you'd never even see an Einstein ring because theoretically it would have to be so tiny, so thin, okay? The portion of the gravitational field that would create the right bending is so tiny that you would never get enough photons to ever see an Einstein ring. And yet they say they have pictures of Einstein rings. So even though Einstein said you can't do it, it wouldn't be theoretically possible, they say they did it. So I could get on to gravity waves next, where Einstein clearly said you're not going to see any of those either. And they had to create a new theory. Okay, they had to, supplement Einstein again by creating some new theory that somehow you can make, gravity out of matter. You can blow up the matter and somehow make bent space. That's the only way they could make mathematically it possible for us to see a gravitational wave. So it's all contrived. It's all mush. The evidence is far from clear and decisive and any of that. And, I'm just saying there's rational theories that you should find intriguing, that, oh yes, it's just that simple. Every time an electron moves, it's being pushed by a force. That force is being slowed down, pushing the matter. Therefore, there's a force differential. Slowing it down is the same as taking some of its momentum away. And the fact is you have more momentum coming down, pushing you from the universe, than there is Earth force pushing you back. And it's that simple. Well, not Earth, going through the Earth. The force going through the Earth is pushing electrons. It's diminished by pushing them, and therefore there's less coming out of the Earth than there is coming from space. And that simple explanation explains gravity. And you don't need a mushy, bent geodesic. You don't need to warp something as obvious and simple as time. Time is not a dimension. There's only 3 dimensions. Dimensions are defined, by having right angles to each other. Dimensions create right angles to each other. There's no room for a 4th dimension. Can't be done. And certainly time is not a dimension. It's a function. It's something that happens because the universe isn't instantaneous, There is a speed of light. Things move slower than instantaneously. Therefore, there's time. But you can't warp it, you can't bend it, you can't escape it. These are all just wooey. They might as well just be religious concepts. They're so unfounded by anything called strong or good or quality evidence. They're just wishful thinking, converted into long told fables. They're just stories. The story of the bent space. It's not a real thing. It's just a 3-pig story. Ugh. So, I would appreciate if somebody could make the counter argument in some sort of similar form, where they explain how, oh no, bent geodesic makes perfect sense, and I understand what it's made out of, and I understand how electrons sense it, and yes, it all makes sense to me. And you can explain why it makes sense to you, why you don't care that they haven't repeated the Eddington experiment, why every other experiment, they claim to show bending of light can also be explained as simple scatter, because they're shooting the light through dense atmospheres around suns or atmospheres around other galactic bodies full of gas or some other thing. Yes, hitting atoms will scatter light. Okay, that's not a contention. Gravity bending light is the subject. Do you have any evidence that gravity bends light? Good evidence. All right. So yeah, that's enough. Through those three subjects are enough right there. I mean, huge subjects: gravity, light, and kinetic energy. I mean, they've gotten them all wrong. Okay, the foundations of physics are just garbage. Yes, I'm saying we should go all the way back to where Newton left the ball, and we should start playing from there, because it became wacky ball after Newton. All right, it lost all connection to reality. That part needs to be erased, and you have to go start over again with, again, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton did a lot of good work. They took you right to the edge of getting all the answers, and you jumped the wrong way, or something like that. So anyway, till the next time, and such and so forth and whatnot. Yeah, that's enough. This has been a DraftPhysics.com video presentation. Debate physics also, but again, nobody to debate, sadly.